Context often gives an interesting indication of how to read a biblical text. Often we simply take the text in isolation and don't think about what necessarily comes before, but sometimes what comes before gives us some help in interpreting what we're reading. A couple of weeks or so ago, we read and we've had over the last couple of Sundays, at least in the back of our minds, the story of Jesus preaching in the synagogue in Nazareth. And we've been thinking about how he drew upon the text from Isaiah and used it to set forth a manifesto for his own ministry, preaching good news to the poor, freedom for captives, sight for the blind, and release for the oppressed. After Luke tells that story, he tells a number of other stories. There's a story about casting out an evil spirit. There's a story about healing Simon's mother-in-law and many others. There's a story about calling Simon Peter the fisherman, which we heard last week. There's a story about calling Levi, the tax collector. And then there are a couple of stories about teaching that Jesus gave. Then comes a short story about appointing the apostles. 12 people are named, drawn from the much larger number of disciples that Jesus had already gathered around him. This act of appointment takes place after Jesus had spent the night in prayer on a mountain. And right after that comes the gospel story that we'll hear in a moment. So far in his gospel, Luke has given us an introduction to the life and the ministry of Jesus, a sample of what he was about and what he did. His purpose is stated, his working methods briefly surveyed, and his closest colleagues named. And now we hear something which at the same time sounds a bit familiar and a bit different. We're probably more used to hearing Matthew's version of this teaching, so used, in fact, that when we say the Beatitudes, it's Matthew's version that we mean. There are, of course, similarities, but there are also differences. Matthew lists 9 sayings beginning with the word blessed. Luke gives 4, followed by 4 sayings beginning with the word woe. There's something different going on here. But consider this. In Matthew, Jesus goes up a mountain to give this teaching, choosing an actually and symbolically elevated position. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. The high up place indicates closeness to God. But in Luke, Jesus first prays on the mountain, close to God, seeking and gaining divine inspiration, and then comes down to a level place. A good move, perhaps, to allow the less fit to participate? Well, maybe, but I don't suppose that's the main purpose of this. I think this is symbolic, as so much in the Gospels is. Symbolic of engagement with the world as it is. In those times and in that culture, places which were low down were often associated with rubbish, with graveyards, and therefore were places of the dead. And they were places where the poor, the hungry, and the outcast lived. Elevated places, hilltops, were safer. They were cooler in the heat of the sun. They were further from wet ground where mosquitoes and diseases bred. A level place was where life was tough and raw. And it's on a level place, a place low down, that Luke sets this story. Jesus goes down to a level place. There's something here about identifying with and being alongside disadvantaged people, even before he speaks. And it's the right place to deliver this message, a message in which he develops the manifesto outlined in the synagogue in Nazareth. It's a message for the poor, a message for the hungry, a message for those who weep, a message for those who are hated and excluded. It's a message which he delivers, Luke says, to a large crowd of his disciples, people who have these experiences of poverty, of hunger, of weeping, of exclusion in their lives. And the message is that they are blessed. They are blessed. We've heard this, or Matthew's version, so often that it has perhaps lost some of its ability to surprise. How could poverty and hunger and weeping and exclusion be a blessing? I think we need to pause to think a bit about what blessing actually is. We use the word in a variety of ways. We might say something like, having my friend with me when I saw the consultant was a real blessing. And we would mean something which made a hard situation a bit easier to bear. So we use the word blessing in that sense. It may be a wee bit outdated now, but people asked for the blessing of others as a sign of consent or approval or permission. A young man might go to the father of his sweetheart and ask for his blessing on their marriage. Permission to marry the young lady. I said it was a bit outdated. But neither of these ways of using the word blessing, I think, adequately defines it in this context, in the context used by Jesus here in Luke's Gospel. Despite what we might hope, it certainly does not mean absence of struggle. It's not about making life easy. Rather, to be blessed in this context means to be aware in the present time that you have a place in the movement towards the full and complete reign of God. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, so let me try and unpack it a bit. Blessing is not an assurance of a comfortable existence after death, though we all hope for that. Blessing here is about this life. It's about knowing that we are not forgotten by God, no matter what is going on in our lives. It's about knowing that we have a place in the loving purposes of God, that God has a use for us, a purpose for us. It's about being part of the struggle for justice and equity, giving our lives to that great cause. It's about having real purpose in life, purpose not defined by ephemeral things. It may sound like this is counterintuitive, but so much of what Jesus said and stood for was counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive because so often how people think and behave shows that they think that the poor have less value and purpose, that the homeless can be forgotten and ignored, that the ill are a drain on society, that those who weep can be a bit of an embarrassment, that the hungry have probably been feckless, and that those who are hated have brought it on themselves. Jesus says nothing could be further than the truth. And to underline the point, he adds words about the rich, the well-fed, the happy, the ones who get all the compliments. Again, what is really at stake is their place in the movement towards the full and complete reign of God. And Jesus is pointing out that wealth and plenty food and happiness, laughter and high regard should not be seen as ends in themselves. They're not what it's all about. They're not signs that God favors you, especially not when others are poor and hungry and weeping and hated. The loving purposes of God are for everyone, that all might be comfortable and adequately fed and content and loved, not just some. But here's where I think the difficulty is. When we take a good hard look at ourselves, where do we sit? Among the people to whom Jesus says, "Blessed are you," or among the people to whom Jesus says, "Woe to you," uncomfortably, I think that many of us might feel ourselves to be among the latter. The latter, that is, if it is just about having and not having. But that's too simple a distinction. Remember what I said about being aware in the present of having a place in the movement towards the full and complete reign of God. That's what blessing is, having a purpose, being part of the mission of God to the world. It's about having a place in God's plan, but a place which isn't determined by any of the things by which the world seeks to determine place, things like gender and status and education and wealth. It's about taking our place in the loving purposes of God, and using all that we have, and even using the fact that we may lack too, to share with the poor, to eat with the hungry, to weep with those who weep, to stand with the hated, and most of all, to love as God loves. Amen.